Sometimes I like to take a break from LPing and explore more intricate topics pertaining to Pokemon. I haven't done that in a while, so it's about time I got around to it, making a new special feature. I often talk about Smogon's monthly stats as a way to keep track of what's useful and what is less so. But at the turn of the new year, they changed the way they counted those stats. No, it's not as simple as taking a look at every battle and counting how many times each Pokemon was used. At least not anymore. This is a topic I find rather fascinating, so how about we take a look at how they do things now? And yes, before we begin, Smogon already has a thread explaining that, but it's a bit hard to swallow for the average player, even if most visitors on this channel know better than to use a 4-fire move Charizard. So I'm going to try and make it a bit easier to understand and toss out the headache-inducing math. Well, at least most of it. I'll try. Don't make any promises. First, we have to wrap our heads around the fundamental concept. Tiering does not represent power, but rather the threat degree Pokemon represent in various tiers. I will readily admit that when Smogon adopted this way of thinking in early Gen 4, I wasn't terribly fond of it, to say the least. But as the metagame developed and became more complex, it became clear that there was no other way to do things objectively, as usefulness is only in the eye of the beholder. Of course, it's somewhat easy to pick a winner among Pokemon that share something in common, such as typing, for example. For instance, few will argue against the fact that Dragonite is better than Salamence, although Salamence does have assets, and by that I mean Moxie, that make many people choose it over Dragonite anyway. But even there, it's not always this easy. Based on their own merits, as we've seen in Generation 4, Swampert is vastly superior to Gastrodon. However, the reality of Generation 5's rain-infested metagame makes Gastrodon the go-to guy, thanks to its immunities to the main two types that are boosted by rain, making Gastrodon into a more threatening force, hence why it's overused while Swampert is relegated to underused. Bottom line is, a Pokemon is tiered depending on how threatening and effective it is, not necessarily based on its actual power. Because, let's be honest here, how do you quantify power in an objective manner? The answer should be obvious. You don't. Of course, there can be weird anomalies sometimes. For example, Ditto. Ditto's a rather extreme case of that. It's a potent threat in overuse that isn't used quite enough to make the cutoff line. So you'd expect it to rank high in underused, right? Nope! It misses the cutoff line in underused, and again in rarely used, and depending on the quarter, again in never used. Therefore, it's ranked in either never used or PU, despite its effectiveness in overused. This is another quirk of the tiering system that we have to deal with, I guess. Before we move on to the meat of this video, it would be a good idea to explain what the cutoff line for each tier is, as well as the monthly waiting for quarterly tier updates. First, the former. A Pokemon resides in a certain tier if, when playing 20 battles in that tier, the odds of running into it at least once are higher than 50%. In a nutshell, this means a Pokemon will be overused if it's found on at least 3.41% of all teams entered in a given quarter. Another thing to note is that months are not weighted equally in quarterly updates. The month right before the update counts for 5/6 of the total, the month before that 1/8, and the month before that 1/24. This, for the record, did not change with the method change for calculating tiering. What did change, however, was the way player skill affected how their team was weighted in the stats. The reasons for this change are twofold. The first one existed in the Pokémon Online days, and I'm talking about trolls intent on spamming the stats and make Pokémon rank higher than they really should. Since I'm not really in the know, I don't know just how effective it was, but given the amount of battles fought in a month, it would be scary to imagine someone having such a pitiful life that they would actually succeed in altering the stats to an extent. But since this was a real concern, obviously we've got textbook cases of Get a Fucking Life playing on Pokemon simulators. And that is sad. Especially when you realize that there was a system in place where any battle that lasted less than 6 turns wasn't counted, making it that much harder to forfeit over and over while still having an effect on stats. The second reason, however, is brand new to Pokémon Showdown. Not only is the simulator itself a lot easier to pick up, but Smogon's server is the default choice. What this essentially results into is an influx of inexperienced casual players. See where I'm going with this? Suddenly we got a whole lot more people using teams that are suboptimal at best, awful at worst, and barely have any notion of how to use them effectively. Of course, this has the potential to do a number on monthly stats. Now remember what I said about Smogon's definition of tiers? They're threat lists, and an influx of Zardtards using their favorite willy-nilly would have the potential to actually make it overused without it being any more of a threat at all, whether in overused or underused. Which is exactly what would be happening had they kept the old system, as a favorite of those casual newcomers is Ash-based teams. No joke! What are Pikachu's most common teammates, you ask? Charizard, Blastoise, Venusaur, Snorlax, and Lapras. Keep that in mind, because I'll be coming back to this later and show you some crazy numbers to prove it. Either way, by now you should see the usefulness of weeding out the crap to keep tiers as threat lists instead of making them into popularity contests. So how do we do this? Enter the Glyco rating system, which is what Pokémon Showdown uses. I'm not about to make your head explode with how it works, especially since I'm not sure I get it myself, but if you're interested, you can look it up on Wikipedia. It's spelled Glicko for the record. There are a few things we need to know about it, though. The Glyco rating is not one, but rather 2 numbers, a rating and a deviation. This means that there's no true number that's your definitive rating, but the likelihood of a certain number being your rating follows a normal distribution of a center located at your rating and of a width of your deviation. Once again, if you want to know more about normal distributions, you can check out Wikipedia, but I'm just going to show you this graph to give you an idea of what the rating and deviation eat during the winter. As you can see, even though the player represented by the blue line has a higher rating, his deviation is high enough that it's still quite possible that his real rating, which I remind you there's no way to know, is lower than the red player. Now the basic idea with the Glyco system is that you start with a rating of 1500 and a deviation of 350. When you win, your rating increases, and when you lose, it decreases. Theoretically, the average true rating should be close to the 1500 a new player starts with. So the average player can be defined as having a true rating of 1500. This notion is important as the new method of weighing the monthly stats hinges on whether the player is above average. As there's no way to know a player's true rating, the weight he will be given corresponds to the likelihood that said true rating is above 1500. For instance, if his rating is 1500, since the normal distribution is symmetrical, the probability of his true rating being higher than 1500 is 50%. Therefore, whenever he uses a certain Pokemon, it will count as half a use. To give you a further idea of how rating and deviation affect weighing, Antar from Smogon provided a few more examples in his thread where he explains the new method. For instance, a rating of 1576 plus minus 105 gives a weighting of 0.77. A rating of 1394 plus minus 139 gives a weighting of 0.223, and a rating of 1946 plus minus 177 gives a weighting of 0.994. And the top rating on the ladder as of that thread's writing was 2120 plus minus 55 for a weighting of 1. This weighting system has many advantages. First, it doesn't handicap a decent player too much compared to the top players. Of course, there's a difference, but it's not that significant, all things considered. Since even your typical rating that's around 1600 will count for around 80%. Bad players and trolls, on the other hand, are barely accounted for. Both of these effects are illustrated on this graph. The top 20% of all players account for about 35% of the stats, and since the slope of the curve remains constant about a third of the way through, this means that if you're in the top third, your weight will be extremely close to 1. Meanwhile, the bottom 22.5% put together only account for 1% of the stats, silencing them almost completely. Before taking a look at the impact this has on the stats, let's have a look at what the stats tables actually look like. This is the top 25 list for the month of February 2013 on the Overused ladder. Of course, the rank and Pokémon names need no introduction, so let's go straight to the third column, which is the usage percentage after the weighting process. This is what is used for tiering purposes. The fourth column represents the absolute amount of times a Pokémon was used before weighting, and the fifth, the corresponding percentage. So before any kind of stat manipulation, you can take for granted that Scizor was used 139,645 times, and that it was featured on 18.88% of all teams. If you go to the detailed stats, you can see the average weight of Scizor users, which was 0.53. This means that the number of weighted users for Scizor is 139,645 multiplied by 0.53. That is 74,024. As you can see, Politoed ranked ahead of Dragonite, despite being used less times overall. This means that the average weight of those who used Politoed is much higher than that of those who use Dragonite, which makes sense because lesser ranked players wouldn't necessarily be aware of how good Rain is, and instead would just resort to the big guy with the massive stats. For all that, Dragonite isn't just huge stats either. Finally, the sixth and seventh columns represent the amount of times that a Pokémon was actually used in battle. That is to say, it got out of its Pokéball at least once. So basically, Scizor was never used in 29,000 fights, despite being on the player's team.